A new beginning at 72. Richard Carter never thought he would wake up one day and feel utterly lost. At 72, he had seen and experienced life in all its beauty and cruelty, falling in love, raising a family, building a career, and then watching it all slip away one by one. His wife, Margaret, had been his anchor for nearly 50 years. When she passed away 5 years ago, something inside him shattered. His days had become painfully predictable. Mornings spent staring blankly at the kitchen table, afternoons dozing, off in front of an old television, and nights lying awake, haunted by the deafening silence of his empty house. The thought of aging alone, of growing weaker with every passing day, of waiting for an inevitable end, it terrified him. This wasn't living. This was just waiting to die. Then, one cold winter morning, as he rummaged through an old chest in the attic, Richard found something unexpected, a worn-out leather journal tucked away beneath layers of dust. He recognized it immediately. It was Margaret's. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, each one filled with her graceful handwriting. But it wasn't just a diary, it was something far more profound. Margaret had been a devoted Buddhist in her later years, and in these pages she had written down teachings, reflections, and simple practices that had helped her find peace, even as she faced death. One passage stood out. "My love, if you are reading this, then I am no longer with you. But don't let grief steal what remains of your life. Suffering is inevitable, but peace is a choice. The body may age, but the spirit can remain young if we learn how to truly live. Start today. Breathe, walk, eat, love. You are still here. That means your story isn't over." Richard's breath caught in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, a spark, a whisper, a call to wake up. That night, instead of drowning in sorrow, he did something different. He sat in silence, closed his eyes, and listened to his breath. It was shaky, uneven, unfamiliar, but it was still there, and so was he. This is the story of how Richard Carter, a man who had resigned himself to old age and loneliness, found a new beginning. How he discovered that 72 wasn't the end of the road, but the start of something deeper, a journey of healing, of rediscovery, of learning how to truly live, even in the face of time. If you've ever felt lost, if you've ever wondered if it's too late to change, if you've ever questioned whether peace and happiness are still within your reach, this story is for you. Stay with us as we walk through the powerful Buddhist principles that transformed Richard's life, and can transform yours too. Finding his way back, the art of mindful living. Richard Carter had spent years waking up to the same dull routine, pouring a cup of coffee he barely tasted, staring blankly at the morning paper, and watching the hours slip by without meaning. His mind drifted constantly between the past and the future, replaying old memories, dreading the years ahead. He wasn't living, he was merely existing. The idea of mindfulness had always seemed distant to him, something abstract, reserved for monks and philosophers. But after discovering Margaret's journal and reading her words about presence, he felt something stir inside him, a quiet longing, a hope that maybe, just maybe, there was another way to experience the time he had left. The first morning he attempted mindfulness, he failed. He sat on the couch, closed his eyes, and tried to focus on his breath, but instead of peace, all he found was frustration. The silence was deafening. His mind was restless, pulling him back to the life he had lost. Margaret's smile, the sound of her voice calling him for dinner, the way their house once felt full of laughter. The more he tried to empty his thoughts, the louder they became. He opened his eyes, exhaled sharply, and muttered, "This is pointless." That afternoon, while walking through the park, he noticed a gardener, an older man carefully trimming a bush, his movements slow and deliberate. There was something calming about the way he worked, as if nothing else in the world existed but the leaves beneath his hands. Richard stopped to watch. The gardener looked up and smiled. "Ever tried gardening?" the man asked. Richard shook his head. "Never had the patience for it," the gardener chuckled. "It's not about patience, it's about paying attention. That evening, instead of sitting alone with his thoughts, Richard decided to try something new. He stepped outside into his neglected backyard, where an old garden bed had been overrun with weeds. Margaret had once loved this space, spending hours tending to her roses. He had let it wither since she passed, unable to bear the sight of it, without her. For the first time in years, he knelt down in the dirt and pulled out the weeds, feeling the earth between his fingers. He didn't think about the past or the future. He just focused on the simple act of working with his hands, the texture of the soil, the warmth of the setting sun, the scent of fresh earth. The next morning, he woke up with a plan. Instead of drinking his coffee absent-mindedly, he took a moment to inhale its aroma before taking a sip. Instead of eating his breakfast while staring at the TV, he chewed slowly, tasting every bite. Throughout the day, he made an effort to notice small things: the feel of the wooden floor beneath his bare feet, the cool breeze from the open window, the distant sound of a dog barking. Over the weeks, mindfulness became less of an effort and more of a habit. He started going on walks without his usual distractions, simply listening to the world around him. He spent time in the garden every evening, not just as a chore, but as a form of meditation. He even tried mindful cooking, paying attention to the rhythm of chopping vegetables, the sizzle of food in the pan, the warmth of the kitchen. Little by little, something shifted. His mind, once a constant battlefield of regret and fear, began to quiet. His nights became less restless. His heart felt lighter. One evening, as he sat in his backyard watching the flowers bloom under the soft glow of twilight, he realized something. He had spent years believing that happiness belonged to the past, or was something to chase in the future. But in reality, it had always been here in the simple, ordinary moments he had overlooked. For the first time in years, Richard felt truly alive. Reclaiming strength. From resistance to movement, Richard had never been the kind of man who enjoyed exercise. In his younger years, he had stayed active out of necessity, mowing the lawn, carrying groceries, chasing after his children when they were small. But as the years passed, movement became something he did less and less. His joints ached, his back stiffened, and every morning it felt harder to get out of bed. Eventually, he settled into a slow, sedentary routine, convincing himself that at 72, there was no point in trying to change. Then came the wake-up call. One morning, as he climbed the stairs with a basket of laundry, his legs suddenly gave out. He collapsed onto the step, his breath ragged, his heart pounding. He sat there for several minutes, shaken, unable to stand. He wasn't injured, just weak. The realization hit him hard. He had been so focused on surviving his grief that he hadn't noticed his own body deteriorating. That evening he flipped through Margaret's journal again, searching for guidance. Her words were gentle yet firm. The body is a sacred vessel. If we neglect it, we neglect life itself. Movement is not a punishment, it is an act of love. Richard sighed, rubbing his tired hands over his knees. Love was the last thing he associated with exercise. But something in her words lingered. The next day he forced himself to take a walk. It wasn't much, just down the block and back, but it was enough to remind him how out of shape he had become. His breath was shallow, his legs felt heavy, and by the time he returned home, he collapsed into his chair, exhausted. He almost gave up right then, but the next morning he did it again. And then the morning after that. One afternoon at the park, he noticed a group of older adults practicing Tai Chi, their movements slow and fluid like water flowing through the air. He had seen it before but never paid much attention. That day he watched carefully. There was something different about it, something calming. They weren't forcing their bodies into harsh exercises. They were moving with grace, with intention. Woman from the group, Eleanor, caught him watching and waved him over. "Come join us," she said, smiling. Richard hesitated. "I don't think I can do all that," he admitted, gesturing to their controlled movements. Eleanor chuckled. "You don't have to be good. You just have to start." With a deep breath, he stepped forward. The first few attempts felt awkward. His balance was off, his limbs stiff. But Eleanor guided him patiently, reminding him to focus on his breath, to move with the rhythm of his body instead of against it. For the first time in years, exercise didn't feel like a chore. It felt like presence. Encouraged, he expanded his routine. He stretched lightly before getting out of bed, noticing how his muscles responded. He began practicing mindful walking, paying attention to the way his feet met the earth. He even tried water aerobics at the local senior center, surprised by how light and strong he felt in the water. The results were gradual but undeniable. His knees didn't ache as much. His back felt stronger. He no longer struggled with everyday tasks. More than that, something inside him changed. He wasn't just regaining physical strength. He was reclaiming a part of himself he had long abandoned. One evening, after finishing his Tai Chi practice, he stood in front of the mirror. For years he had avoided looking too closely, afraid of seeing how much he had aged. But now, as he met his own reflection, he didn't see a frail, aging man. He saw someone in motion, someone alive. For the first time in a long time, he smiled. The mindful meal, learning to eat with awareness. Richard had never thought much about food. For most of his life, meals had been a routine, something to be done quickly, often while distracted. He ate his breakfast while flipping through the newspaper, had lunch in front of the television, and finished dinner without truly tasting it. Food was fuel, nothing more. After Margaret passed, his eating habits worsened. He often skipped meals, then ate too much at night. Some days he barely had the energy to cook, settling for frozen dinners or whatever was easiest. Eating alone only reminded him of her absence, and so he stopped caring about what he put into his body. Then one afternoon, while browsing through Margaret's old journal, he found a passage about mindful eating. Every meal is a moment to be present, taste, savor, give thanks. In eating with awareness, we nourish not just the body, but the soul. He set the journal down and looked at his half-eaten sandwich. He couldn't even remember taking the last few bites. It was as if he had eaten on autopilot. Was this what his life had become, going through the motions without really being there? That evening, Richard decided to do something different. Instead of eating in front of the TV, he set the table properly, lighting a candle like he and Margaret used to do on special occasions. He made himself a simple meal, vegetable soup and a slice of bread, but this time he ate it slowly. He paid attention to the warmth of the broth, the texture of the bread, the blend of flavors on his tongue. For the first time in years, he actually tasted his food. The next morning, he took it further. Instead of rushing through his coffee, he sat by the window, feeling the warmth of the mug in his hands, inhaling the rich aroma before taking a sip. He closed his eyes, savoring the bitterness, the way it lingered on his tongue. It was a small act, but something about it felt deeply satisfying, as if he were truly present for the first time in a long while. Encouraged by this new awareness, he decided to change his relationship with food entirely. He started going to the farmer's market, choosing fresh ingredients instead of processed meals. He took the time to cook for himself, even experimenting with new recipes. He found joy in the rhythm of chopping vegetables, the sizzle of onions in a pan, the fragrance of herbs filling his kitchen. One day he came across a community cooking class at the senior center. On a whim, he signed up. The first session was awkward. He hadn't cooked with others in years. But as he listened to the laughter around him, as he shared stories with strangers over a simmering pot of soup, he felt something shift. Food wasn't just about eating. It was about connection, about being part of something bigger than himself. A few weeks later, he invited his neighbor, an elderly widower named George, over for dinner. It was the first time in years he had shared a meal with someone at his own table. As they ate, Richard realized how different this moment felt compared to his solitary, mechanical meals of the past. There was warmth in the conversation, an ease, in the silence between bites. Eating had once been a mindless act, something to get through. Now it was an experience, a moment to be cherished, a way to nourish not just his body but his soul. One evening, as he sat outside with a bowl of fresh fruit, feeling the cool breeze on his skin, he thought about how much had changed. He had spent years eating without thinking, without feeling, but now every meal was a chance to be present, to appreciate life in its simplest form. For the first time in a long time, food wasn't just something to consume. It was something to be grateful for. The joy of giving, finding new purpose in life. Richard had spent years believing that his best days were behind him. After Margaret passed, he felt like a man without purpose. His children had their own lives. His career was long over, and the house that was once filled with love and laughter had become unbearably quiet. He had always thought retirement would be a time of relaxation, a reward for years of hard work. Instead, it felt like an endless stretch of empty days, each one blending into the next. Then, one afternoon, something changed. He was at the local grocery store, standing in line at the checkout, when he noticed an elderly woman in front of him, struggling with her bags. She looked frail, her hands trembling as she tried to lift them. Without thinking, Richard stepped forward. "Let me help you with that," he said. She looked up, surprised, then smiled. "That's very kind of you." As he carried her bags to her car, she thanked him again. "You have no idea how much this means to me," she said. "I don't have much strength these days, and it's hard doing everything alone." Richard nodded, understanding all too well what that felt like. That small act of kindness stayed with him. He had spent so much time thinking about what he had lost, about the emptiness in his own life, that he had never considered how many others might be feeling the same way. That night, he opened Margaret's journal once again. "Happiness isn't what we keep for ourselves, but in what we give away. In giving, we find meaning. In helping others, we heal ourselves." The words struck him deeply. He had been searching for something, some reason to keep going, some way to fill the void, but maybe the answer wasn't in what he could gain. Maybe it was in what he could give. The next morning, Richard took a walk through town and found himself outside the community center. A sign on the door caught his attention. "Volunteers needed, senior reading program." He hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. A week later, he found himself sitting in a small, cozy room at the senior center, reading aloud to a group of elderly residents, some of whom had failing eyesight or struggled with dementia. At first, he wasn't sure what to expect. Would they even care about the stories he read? Would they listen? But as he turned the pages and read with careful inflection, he saw something remarkable. Their faces softened. Some closed their eyes, as if transported to another time. Others smiled, nodding along to familiar passages. After the session, one of the residents, an elderly man named Walter, approached him. "You have a way with words," Walter said. "It's been years since I've heard someone read like that. Reminds me of when my wife used to read to me before bed." Richard felt a lump in his throat. He knew that feeling, the warmth of a voice, the comfort of a familiar presence. Encouraged, he started looking for other ways to help. He began driving his neighbor, George, who had stopped driving due to poor eyesight, to his weekly doctor's appointments. He started volunteering at the local food bank, helping pack meals for families in need. One afternoon, he even found himself sitting on a park bench with a young man struggling with anxiety, simply listening as the boy poured out his worries. Each act, no matter how small, filled him in a way he hadn't expected. The more he gave, the less alone he felt. The more he reached out, the more connected he became. One evening, as he sat on his porch sipping tea, he realized something profound. He had spent years thinking that life had taken so much from him. But in giving to others, he had discovered something he thought he had lost forever. A sense of purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning, a feeling of belonging. Margaret had been right all along. Happiness wasn't in holding on. It was in letting go, in sharing what remained, and in doing so, Richard hadn't just helped others, he had saved himself. Embracing impermanence, from fear to serenity, Richard had always been afraid of death. It wasn't just the thought of dying that unsettled him. It was the idea of disappearing, of becoming nothing. Over the years, he had lost so much: his parents, his old friends, his beloved Margaret. Each loss chipped away at him, leaving behind an unshakable fear that one day he too would fade into the past, forgotten like an old photograph left in a dusty attic. For a long time, he tried to ignore it. He kept himself busy, filling his days with routines, volunteering, and small acts of kindness. But in the quiet moments, When the house was still and the night stretched endlessly, the fear returned. It crept into his mind like a shadow, whispering the same unsettling question. What happens when it's my turn? Then one afternoon, something changed. He was walking through the park when he noticed a group of children playing beneath a massive oak tree. They were gathering fallen leaves, throwing them into the air, laughing as the wind carried them away. Richard stood there, watching. To the children, the falling leaves weren't a sign of decay. They were something magical, something beautiful. That evening, he found himself flipping through Margaret's journal again. He had read it cover to cover, but somehow a passage he had overlooked before caught his eye. Everything changes. The river never holds the same water twice. The tree you see today will not be the same tree tomorrow. To fear change is to fear life itself. But when we embrace impermanence, we learn to cherish every moment, knowing it will never come again. Richard sat still, absorbing the words. For years he had fought against the inevitable. He had spent so much time dreading the future that he had forgotten to truly live in the present. Determined to understand this concept more deeply, he decided to visit a Buddhist temple he had heard about from a friend. It was a simple place, nestled at the edge of town, surrounded by tall bamboo and quiet gardens. There he met an elderly monk named Thomas, who welcomed him with a warm smile. "I have a question," Richard said after a long pause. "How do you stop being afraid of death?" The monk didn't answer right away. Instead, he led Richard outside to a small pond. The water was still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Thomas picked up a handful of petals and scattered them across the surface. They floated for a moment, then slowly sank. "Would you say the petals are gone?" the monk asked. Richard frowned. "They're not here anymore, but they were." Thomas nodded. "Exactly. Just because something changes form doesn't mean it ceases to exist. Life is like this pond. We come into being, we float for a while, and then we return to where we came from. But while we are here, we reflect the sky, the trees, the world around us. We are part of something greater than ourselves." For the first time in his life, Richard saw death not as an ending, but as a transformation. The fear that had clung to him for so long loosened its grip. He realized he had been looking at it all wrong. It wasn't about how much time he had left. It was about how he chose to live the time he had. Inspired by this new perspective, Richard began a new practice. Every morning, he walked to the park and sat beneath the same oak tree where the children played. He watched the leaves fall, not with sadness but with appreciation. Every evening he lit a candle in his home, letting the flame remind him of life's fleeting beauty. One day, he decided to write a letter to his children, not a will, not a list of instructions, but a reflection on everything he had learned. He told them about the joy of presence, the gift of giving, and the peace that came with accepting life's impermanence. He ended with Margaret's words, "To fear change is to fear life itself. But when we embrace impermanence, we learn to cherish every moment, knowing it will never come again." That night, as Richard sat on his porch, watching the last light of the sun fade into the horizon, he didn't feel fear. He didn't feel regret. He felt peace. A life reclaimed, lessons from a journey of renewal. Richard Carter never imagined that at 72 he would begin again. He had once believed that aging meant losing love, losing purpose, losing the ability to change. But as he walked through the last chapter of his life, he realized something profound. Life had never stopped offering him chances to grow. He had simply stopped noticing them. Through mindfulness, he learned to be present, to savor the smallest moments. A sip of coffee, the warmth of sunlight on his face, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. He had spent years trapped in the past, mourning what was gone, but he had found his way back by embracing what was still here. Through movement, he rediscovered his own strength. His body, once neglected and stiff, became a source of vitality, again. With every step he took, every breath he deepened, he was reminded that he was still alive, and that alone was a reason to keep going. Through mindful eating, he found joy in something as simple as a meal. Food was no longer just fuel, but an act of gratitude, a connection to the present. Each bite, each flavor, each shared meal became a reminder that life was meant to be tasted, not just endured. Through giving, he uncovered a truth that changed everything. Happiness was never about what he had lost, but about what he could still give. In offering kindness, in sharing moments with others, in being present for someone in need, he found a purpose far greater than himself. Through embracing impermanence, he let go of his deepest fear. He no longer saw aging as a slow decline, but as an unfolding, a natural rhythm of life. He understood now that nothing was truly lost, only transformed. Richard's journey was not just about aging gracefully. It was about living fully until the very end. And that is the lesson he wished for others to learn. To those who feel that time is slipping away, who wonder if it's too late to change, who fear the loneliness and uncertainty of growing older, Richard's story is proof that renewal is always possible. The past may be behind you, but the present is still yours to embrace. Start where you are, take a breath. Notice the moment, move your body, taste your food, give to others, and most of all, live with open hands, not clenched fists, because nothing in this life is truly ours to keep, except the love we share and the moments we cherish. If Richard could find his way back to joy, so can you. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, if you found inspiration in Richard's transformation, consider following our channel Buddhist Life Philosophy for more wisdom, guidance, and stories that remind us what it truly means to live. Let's walk this path together. Subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and continue your journey toward peace, presence, and purpose.